Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents Elections, a very short introduction, by L. Sandy Maisel and Jennifer A. Yoder, narrated by Eric Jason Martin. Preface. We were colleagues in the government department at Colby College for 25 years, until Maisel's retirement in 2021. Maisel specializes in American politics and has written extensively on American political parties and elections. Yoder is a comparativist, specializing in German politics and society and the politics of the European integration. Her writing focuses on memory, politics, and identity. Our teaching and research interests have drawn us to examine the roles of institutions and rules and how they affect politics in different countries and different American states. This project began as a proposal from Maisel to Oxford University Press to write a VSI on electoral rules. Nancy Toff, who edited Maisel's earlier VSI on American political parties and elections, suggested that the idea had merit, but that it would be much more interesting with a comparative perspective. Maisel agreed, but noted he did not have that expertise, and thus a collaboration was born. We began to think about this book shortly after the 2020 American presidential election, in the context of a deeply troubling electoral process. Never before in American history, not at the nation's inception, not during the Civil War, not during the communist witch hunt in the 1950s, not when elections were agonizingly close as they were in 1960 and again in 2000, has a losing presidential candidate failed to concede to the winner. But that is exactly what Donald Trump did, and the flaws in the American electoral process were revealed for everyone to see. We saw discontent among American citizens and a questioning of how the nation had arrived at such a state, and we began to look more deeply. The questions that drove our study were basic. What were the flaws that the 2020 election revealed? Why did they exist? And of special interest to us, were there lessons that American politicians and political reformers could learn from other countries that could be applied to the United States? If so, what were they? Obviously, elections are multifaceted. At the macro level, countries differ from each other because of their constitutional designs and party systems. These are interrelated, but not necessarily determinative of each other. They differ regarding who can vote, how they vote, for whom they vote, and whether they vote. They differ in terms of how elections are administered. All of these have implications for the results of the electoral process, for who is elected, for how citizens relate to their elected officials, for the kinds of governing institutions that exist in a polity, and for the kinds of policies that are adopted. We quickly understood that the task we laid out for ourselves was no small one, and that covering it in the confines of a very short introduction would not be easy. But it has been fruitful for us. Writing this book enabled us to separate out those aspects of the electoral process that are fundamental to free, fair, open, and transparent elections, and those that are peripheral. We have tried to separate our preferences, and ours are not always the same, from those aspects of elections that are fundamental. And mostly we have tried to encourage listeners to think about their own views of the electoral process in their home country in a new way, not simply to understand what happens in elections, but to examine what the implications are of the ways in which elections are organized and run, to think about the values they believe should be expressed through the electoral process, and whether that with which they are most familiar can be improved. Americans take great pride in their electoral process. As we were concluding this project, however, the Electoral Integrity Project, an academic research project based at Harvard University and Sydney University, released its 2022 report that rated the electoral integrity of the American electoral system 59th worldwide, and last among liberal democracies. There is no pride in that, and our hope is that the analysis in this book gives listeners, especially American listeners, food for thought about electoral reform. But there are no panaceas, and reform that might be desirable is not always politically possible. As we finish writing this book, the January 6th Committee of the U.S. House of Representatives has released its report on the aftermath of the 2020 election, and all of the problems that dreadful day revealed with the way in which Americans elect their president. But at the same time, Israel held its fifth national election in 3 years because their system has not produced a government that can be sustained. Brazil's president, Jair Bolsonaro, stoked fears about election fraud in the run-up to general elections in his country, and his followers threatened the kinds of disruptions seen in Washington. And voters in Kenya voiced skepticism of the candidate selection process and their relatively new electronic voting system. We could easily draw on other examples, as democracies worldwide struggle to meet their citizens' needs. Our hope in this book is to raise questions about the process for citizens in many countries. Electoral rules and processes are not exciting. They do not draw the fervor of a country's citizens, but they do lead to important decisions and choices with critical implications for citizens of any nation, and thus deserve all of our attention. Chapter 1. Elections Around the World. Most citizens have a basic understanding of how elections work in their own country, but they do not think much about the mechanisms through which elections function, especially if they follow the normal patterns. To use an illustration from the United States, American voters did not think much about how their president was elected following most of the elections at the end of the 20th century. The person who received the most votes simply became president. Then, in 2000, Al Gore won the most votes, but George W. Bush won the election, after the Supreme Court intervened during the counting of votes in Florida and awarded that state's electoral votes to Bush. Hardly a normal election, the Bush-Gore contest caused Americans to ask questions about the process through which their national leader was chosen. Why were there challenges surrounding the counting of votes, the infamous hanging chads, in one state and not in others? How could the winner of the popular vote not win in the Electoral College? And why did the highest court in the country get involved in the determination of the winner? Again, in 2016, the winner of the popular vote in the U.S. presidential election did not win the majority of the Electoral College votes, allowing Donald Trump to prevail over Hillary Clinton. Voters again had questions about the outcome, and certainly nothing was normal about the election of 2020, including the way in which the votes were counted and the losing incumbent's refusal to accept the results. Understandably, Americans have come to question the process through which their elections are run. Most may not understand the nuances of the process, but they are sure they do not like what they see. When most elections in modern democracies produce obvious winners, citizens in those countries accept the result and, by implication, the process through which the result was achieved. But what about when the voting does not produce a result that is so apparent? Elections in Belgium have produced highly fragmented results, making it difficult to form governing coalitions. In 2010, it took 541 days after the elections to negotiate a new Belgian government. After the coalition government broke down in 2018, it took 2 years to form a government. Between 2019 and 2022, Israelis went to the polls 5 times because none of the first 4 elections produced a stable governing coalition. These situations demonstrate the significance of elections for governing, but even more fundamentally, they point to the importance of understanding how and why elections function as they do. What difference do electoral rules make? What is the range of possible election systems? And how might reforms to election rules strengthen the principles that an electorate deems most important? The most important reason to study electoral rules is that they often impact the way in which an election is conducted, the result of that election, and the ability of citizens to effect policy change through the electoral process. Elections determine who will hold public office and who will have the power to govern. They connect citizens to those they choose to make decisions on their behalf and to regulate their behavior. Yet not all elections in democracies are alike. and not all elections accomplish this task equally well. The rules of the game are not neutral, but most citizens, and most politicians, are familiar only with the system in which they function. Anything else is alien, and often viewed as inferior and unworthy of serious consideration. But in fact, there is no best system. In choosing how elections are to be run, officials in every country make decisions that involve trade-offs. It is worth looking at those trade-offs and asking what the implications are of using one set of rules or another. Electoral rules are expressions of priorities in a system of governance. They influence political participation by determining how easy or difficult it is to vote or to be a candidate. Importantly, electoral rules affect how faithfully the elected office holders reflect society, and in doing so, how they affect office holding by minority populations and the expression of views and policy preferences often overlooked by powerful groups. Both considerations, access and representation, can affect the peace in and stability of a society. Electoral rules also have impacts on other institutions, such as the fate of smaller parties, the nature of the political party system, and the formation and durability of governments. Different electoral systems facilitate or limit the emergence and success of new parties, foster either two-party or multi-party systems, and affect the ability of those elected to office to form a government. The more proportional the outcome of an election is, the more likely governance will feature multiple parties and coalition governments. The representational value of proportionality, which is tempered by the complexity that those elected in such a system face in governing, is in contrast to the relative ease of governing that occurs in systems that force electoral majorities at the expense of proportional representation, PR. To return to the examples of Belgium and Israel, both have electoral systems based on proportionality, leading to numerous political parties and often complicated and lengthy negotiations after elections to form a government. The resulting multi-party governments can often be unstable. In contrast, in the United States, electoral rules favor two political parties at the expense of smaller ones. After legislative elections, one party holds a majority in the House of Representatives, usually leading to stable governance. The overall result, though, is far from proportional. To illustrate, The Economist provided a visual of what the 2016 election result would have been under proportionality with multiple parties vying for seats, based on polling data. A coalition of center-left parties, likely led by Hillary Clinton, would have resulted, rather than a Republican-led government under Donald Trump. Electoral rules are shaped by historical experience and, typically, by the preferences of system designers when it comes to accessibility to participation in the politics of the system, societal representation, and models of governance. The designers, we can assume, intended to preserve their own electoral advantages. The oldest and simplest modern electoral system, the plurality system, is found in the United Kingdom and many of its former colonies. In the plurality system, often called first past the post, FPTP, the candidate with the largest share of the vote wins the office or seat. Electoral systems adopted more recently tend to feature PR, where the share of seats a party is awarded is proportionate to its share of the overall vote, or they are hybrids, with some seats won by plurality and some by proportionality. Other countries use preferential voting, PV, systems, allowing voters to rank candidates when casting their ballots. There are many other elements of electoral system design that have consequences for elections and governance. The preferences of the original designers of an electoral system, most often those in power at the time the electoral rules were adopted, determined the system in play, reflecting their political values and benefiting their own power perspectives. Election systems and their trade-offs matter because they have clear implications for a number of outcomes, including system legitimacy. As an obvious example, the U.S. citizens who protested the results of the 2020 presidential election on January 6, 2021, attempting to prevent the U.S. Congress from certifying the election of Joe Biden, did not believe that he was a legitimate winner. Their skepticism was the result of the ways they perceived the election had been unfair, because of some aspects of how elections are run in the United States. For example, the roles of local officials in deciding how votes are cast, in person, by mail, dropped at unattended boxes, etc., and in counting the votes and certifying the winner, those who protested did not think the election had been free and fair. Similarly, participation in politics is affected by the rules of the system, including who can run for office, who can vote, and how easily citizens can do either. How satisfied are citizens with their system's openness and transparency? If they are dissatisfied, do they understand why, and what alternatives exist? Satisfaction with the process might vary with whether citizens feel they have a fair chance to be represented or elected. Electoral rules impact the chances that women or members of a country's ethnic, racial, or religious minority groups have of becoming candidates or winning office, and that a range of views and experiences will be expressed in government, often through minor political parties. And these all, in turn, have clear implications for a country's ability to manage conflict of all sorts. If officials understand the implications of trade-offs as they determine electoral rules, the system chosen may well be better suited for the country involved. And if voters understand the system and find its features to be commensurate with the values and principles they hold dear, they may be more likely to approve of the electoral system and to show that approval by participating in elections and recognizing the legitimacy of election outcomes. Elections to what? Electoral rules are one of many institutional features in democratic systems. Electoral rules may be among the easiest political institutions to alter, since changes to them do not necessarily require constitutional amendment. In many cases, they are changed through legislation or even administrative actions. The United States is an exception, but not the norm, in that change to some of the fundamental dimensions of the electoral system would require a constitutional amendment. Electoral systems and rules, which determine how elections are run and results determined, interact with other features of political systems, such as the way the government is structured, for example, whether it is presidential or parliamentary, or a hybrid of the two. Many combinations are possible, and some patterns are possible to identify. Presidential systems feature elections for the top political office, the presidency, where voters cast a vote for a single candidate and the top vote-getter wins the office or seat. In some countries, a majority is needed to win, whereas in others, a plurality suffices. In some countries, like the United States or the Vatican, votes cast by electors in a body specifically constituted to carry out the election, known as the Electoral College in the United States, determine the winner of the presidency, but in most countries, presidents are chosen by popular vote. Moreover, when presidential systems elect their legislatures, there may be a range of electoral rules. In the United States, members of the legislature are elected much like the president, minus the Electoral College. Voters cast a vote for a candidate in an electoral constituency or district, and the plurality winner of the vote takes the legislative seat. In other presidential systems, however, when electing representatives to the national legislature, voters may cast a vote for a single candidate in their district, or for a political party list, or for both. In Argentina's presidential system, the legislature is elected by PR. In the presidential systems of Mexico, Korea, and Madagascar, the legislatures are elected using FPTP for some seats and PR for others. Parliamentary systems differ in that voters choose representatives to the legislature, and then the newly elected representatives in the majority party, or coalition of parties, in the legislature choose the prime minister and approve cabinet members. There are two broad types of parliamentary systems, distinguished by their electoral systems and patterns of governance. In the Westminster system of the United Kingdom, voters cast a ballot for their member of the House of Commons, and voting is in single-member districts where only one candidate will represent the district, the candidate with a plurality of votes. Once voters have elected members of the Commons, the MPs, members of Parliament, in the party with the most seats select the Prime Minister. Typically, citizens vote for their MP based on which party they want to control the government and on whom they prefer as Prime Minister. Often critical issues separate the parties. Thus, when citizens in the United Kingdom went to the polls in December 2019, they were evaluating Prime Minister Boris Johnson's leadership, particularly his role in implementing the British withdrawal from the European Union. Johnson's party won a landslide majority of 365 seats out of the total 650 seats, with their closest rival, the Labour Party, gaining only 202 seats. As a result, in the ensuing sessions of Parliament, Johnson was able to implement his Conservative Party's agenda with little effective opposition. In the United Kingdom, two parties, Conservative and Labour, dominate, though other parties run candidates and win some seats in Parliament. Because of the dominance of the two parties, after most elections one party achieves a majority and forms the government. That party is then able to govern according to its agenda. The UK is a particular type of parliamentary system, a majoritarian one, in large part because of its electoral rules. Other parliamentary systems have elections in which votes are cast for parties, multiple parties contend for power, and a single party is less likely to win a majority. Most parliaments are not, in fact, majoritarian, but rather are consensus models, featuring proportional electoral rules, multiple parties, and coalition governments. And then there are some parliamentary systems that combine plurality rules and proportional representation to elect their legislatures. Some countries even have different electoral systems for the two houses of their legislature. In bicameral Australia, for example, FPTP is used for the House of Representatives and PR for the Senate. In unicameral New Zealand, to illustrate another variation, 72 members of the 120-seat legislature are elected using the majoritarian system, and 48 members are chosen based on the political party's shares of the national vote. The point here is that the type of democratic government, whether presidential or parliamentary, does not dictate the electoral system of the legislature. Likewise, some presidential systems, for example, the United States, elect their legislatures using candidate-based plurality methods, while others, for example, Mexico, Korea, and Madagascar, combine that method with party-focused proportional rules. Still other presidential systems use PR for all seats in their legislatures. What about the state form? Whether a country is federal or unitary, whether the national government is made up of units like states with some of their own power, or whether all power is focused in the national government. Like the form of government and electoral rules, various combinations are possible. Some federal systems, like those of India, Canada, and the United States, have plurality/majoritarian election rules. Others, such as Belgium and Austria, have proportional, party-focused elections. Federal Germany combines the two electoral systems. Federal systems essentially guarantee representation for geographic regions, which in the United States and Australia and elsewhere lead some regions to have more legislative seats than their population alone would determine. For example, the U.S. Senate is composed of 2 members from each of the 50 states, so that tiny Wyoming, with a population of 500,000, and California, with 39 million, each has 2 senators. Many countries also mandate electoral representation for various groups within their population: women, indigenous people, or citizens living outside of the country's geographic boundaries. Some federal systems, like that of the United States, encompass a variety of electoral rules across their federal states, while others, like Germany, have more uniform rules across the subnational units. The form of government, presidential or parliamentary, and the type of state, unitary or federal, do not dictate the electoral system, but the electoral system influences the nature of competition and governance in every case. Voting. Electoral systems are a central component of the institutional architecture of a democratic country and have consequences for how well a democracy functions, in addition to their implications for other institutions such as parties, party systems, and governments. Electoral systems also matter a great deal for how political contests are viewed and fought, and the nature of public policy. For example, countries vary in terms of how much trust their citizens have that those in charge govern with the best interests of the citizens in mind. One measure of trust in government is whether or not citizens choose to participate through voting. The following table summarizes turnout in recent elections in a sample of countries. In part, turnout is determined by voting laws. Voting is mandatory, for example, for some elections in more than 25 countries, including Australia and, for some cantons, Switzerland. These polities have various types of sanctions for not voting, and they also vary as to whether these sanctions are effectively imposed. Among those countries that do not require citizens to vote, there is considerable variation in turnout. What does low turnout reflect in these nations? Perhaps dissatisfaction with the system, or a feeling that it does not matter whether one votes or not, as the outcome in terms of policy will be the same. Or one could argue that low turnout reflects the opposite view, that people are satisfied with those who govern them and feel they will be satisfied no matter who wins. If that is the case, why should they take the time to vote as opposed to spending their time on other activities? What turnout variation reflects and how much trust citizens have in their government might well depend on which citizens one is considering. That is, some citizens might trust the government and vote because of that, while others might not. Elections determine who will represent citizens in their government. If the electorate does not reflect the population, in terms of turnout or influence, those not represented are more likely to be dissatisfied. Electoral systems vary in terms of how well those with minority views or minority status in a society are represented in elected office. At certain times in history, those factors are clear. The movements for women's suffrage or racial minority suffrage in various countries at various times have acknowledged evident flaws in earlier representational systems. Finally, electoral systems determine how citizen preferences and citizen votes are converted into governmental policies. Table 1. Turnout among eligible voters in a sample of countries. Region, North America. Country, Canada. Percentage of voting age population that voted, 55.43, 2021. Region, North America. Country, United States. Percentage of voting age population that voted, 62.36, 2020. Region, North America. Country, Mexico. Percentage of voting age population that voted, 65.62, 2018. Region, Central America. Country, Costa Rica. Percentage of voting age population that voted, 59.79, 2018. Region, South America. Country, Colombia. Percentage of voting age population that voted, 52.17, 2018. Region, South America. Country, Chile. Percentage of voting age population that voted, 50.43, 2021. Region, South America. Country, Brazil. Percentage of voting age population that voted, 76.66, 2018. Region, Europe. Country, United Kingdom. Percentage of voting age population that voted, 62.04, 2019. Region, Europe. Country, Ireland. Percentage of voting age population that voted, 56.65, 2020. Region, Europe. Country, France. Percentage of voting age population that voted, 67.93, 2017. Region, Europe. Country, Germany. Percentage of voting age population that voted, 69.48, 2021. Region, Europe. Country, Sweden. Percentage of voting age population that voted, 82.08, 2018. Region, Europe. Country, Estonia. Percentage of voting age population that voted, 56.45.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?